Hi everyone, and welcome to another ZombiesRCoolPainting tutorial. Today we're going to be looking at how to paint Dr. Totenkranz, a Reaper model from their Chronoscope line. This is a super high quality model with tons of little intricate details, so without further ado, let's get right into the tutorial. I'm now using my Badger Renegade Chrome airbrush, and I'm also going to be using some US dark green paint by Vallejo Model Air, and this is going to be used to base coat the model, in particular the flesh on the miniature. It's a nice green colour, so it's going to get that sort of sickly, nasty look in the shadows of the miniature. Now, as you can see, obviously the model's already been primed and assembled. I simply cut off all the mold lines and gave it a bit of a cleanup before priming it using the Reaper Master Series white brush-on primer, except naturally I didn't use a brush for it. I used an airbrush, and obviously because of that I had to thin it down considerably so it flowed nice and smooth, but it gets a really nice surface ready for the base colour, which is what we're applying now. Alright, so now we're going to get into doing some highlights, but before we do that I want to quickly bring your attention to the thinner that I like to use for airbrushing. This is my magical custom mix of airbrush thinner, and I'm just going to quickly run down what's in it. So basically it's a mixture of 50% water, 30% drying retarder, 10% fluoride, and 10% matte medium, which creates a nice mixture which I like to use for thinning down all of my acrylic paints for usage in the airbrush. I'm now highlighting the skin on the model using Reaper Master Series MOLDY skin, which is a nice greenish sort of skin tone. And this is a pretty general highlight. I'm pretty much going over most of the model. I'm spraying from like a 45-degree angle and just coating all of the raised areas. I now do the final layer of highlights, or the final airbrush layer of highlights on the flesh tones, and for this I use Vallejo Model Color White Glaze. This is thinned out as per usual and is applied very lightly. I'm not, going heavy with this at all. I'm being very careful not to allow it to pull, and I'm just catching the most raised areas of the model. As you can see, at some points I get the airbrushing quite close, just so I can get those nice fine details. I give the model a gloss coat to protect it from the solvents that we're going to be using in the next stage. I now mix up an oil wash. For the solvent, I use turpentine, and obviously to pigment the wash I use some oil paint, as the name would suggest. For this purpose I decided to use pure black oil paint, and naturally this is an artist grade oil paint because I want it to be nice and high quality. If you use some cheapy dollar store paint, then chances are the pigment won't be good enough for our application. This wash is then applied to the model. Because of the gloss coat, it will flow nice and easily into the recesses, creating some very nice shading effects. I leave the oil wash to dry for around an hour or so, then I come back with a Q-tip and some Windex, and I just clean up any excess pools of wash from the raised surfaces, just to brighten up those areas and make things look a bit nicer. I then give the model a coat of matte varnish just to seal in the wash and give it a nice finish ready for the next stages. I now base coat all of the areas, except obviously for the flesh tones, in black, and this is going to be a good foundation for all the metallic colours we're about to use, and it's also going to give me a good idea of what the flesh tones really look like. I now use an acrylic ink wash, which is mixed up using Vallejo Game Color inks, both the red ink and the sepia ink, and I'm just applying this to all of the flesh areas just to give it a bit of a warmer sort of look. I was looking a bit too green, and I'm going to use some different colours, some washes and some glazes just to sort of brighten it up. I'm also going to up the highlights using some white later. This is just really going to bring this model to life. It's going to enable me to use some colour theory to bring some more visual attractiveness into the flesh tones, and it's just going to really take it to the next level. So this stage is optional. It does take quite a long time, but just these different glazes and different highlight sort of effects I'm going to be doing is really going to up the quality of the paint job on this model. Alright, so now I'm working with some violet ink, which has been thinned out quite a bit, and I'm using this to glaze some of the more shadowed areas. Now this is what I was talking about earlier when I mentioned colour theory. You can see here, because this is violet, obviously it's a colder colour, it's a combination of red and blue, and this is me using some hot and cold colour theory. for those of you who weren't aware, it's a good idea to try and combine hot and cold colours in the one area because it creates more contrast and more visual interest, and it can create some really nice and interesting nuances in the colour, which is why I'm using this here. If you're not really fussed, don't worry about this, but basically that's what I'm doing, and those are my reasons for using this colour as opposed to, you know, black or something like that. For the final highlight, I now use Model Color White Glaze. Again, this is going to be applied very selectively just to the lightest areas where I want the brightest highlights to be, and I'll build this up over a few different layers naturally because it's quite transparent, and you know, I want to get a nice smooth gradient. I have thinned this out a bit just so I get that nice smooth transition, as that is very important, particularly with these final highlights. I now begin painting the rest of the model. Now for the metallics, I'm going to start off with an initial dry brush of Gunmetal Metal by Vallejo Game Color, and I'm going pretty light here. I don't want to be too heavy and absolutely slather everything in bright silver paint. I just want to get the initial sort of impression of some sort of metallic appearance, which is the whole point of this stage. I do a final dry brushed highlight using Silver, again by Vallejo Game Color. This is applied much more lightly and just selectively to the raised areas that would be catching the most light. I now mix up a pigment wash using black and brown pigments as well as some isopropyl alcohol, and I apply this liberally to all of the metallic areas. This is relatively thin because I don't want to dull them down too much, but I do just want to get them sort of, broken up a bit. I want to make sure they're really well defined and they do look just a little bit grubby. Alright, so now we're going to work on the rest of the metallics. Now this is a bit of a tricky stage, not because it's actually difficult, but because I can't really give you that much in the way of instruction. All I really did was I took pretty much every metallic paint I have in my arsenal. I, took it off my shelf, mixed it all up, and then, just did random areas in different random metallics. So I grabbed one metallic paint, painted in a couple of areas, and grabbed another one. And this just basically means that it looks really hodgepodge and there's lots of different colours on there. And, this is what I was going for, because this sort of, to me, looked like it was a contraption built out of scrap metal, as opposed to being some sort of, perfect, fancy, factory-built machine. So I wanted it to look like there was all sorts of different metallics on there. But the basic idea was I'd base coat an area, I'd highlight the area, I'd then give it a wash of a dark sort of colour like a black or a brown or a purple, and then I'd go back over it with some very extreme highlights. As a general rule, my extreme highlights were mixed using bright silver colours, and then the darker colours were either mixed using black into the metallic, or maybe just some duller colours, duller bronze metallics and things like that. I highlight all of the black tubing areas using Reaper Master Series Rainy Grey. Then after I've done that, I finish off the highlights using some pure Vallejo Model Color White Glaze, just for the most extreme highlights where I think a lot of light would be reflecting off the shiny black surface. I base coat all of the thin tubes using P3 Scorn Red. These tubes are then highlighted using Khador Red Base and a combination of Khador Red Base and bronzed flesh. Naturally, whenever I'm highlighting, I thin out the paint slightly so I get nice smooth gradations between the shadow and the highlight colours. I then paint in the thicker tubes using a pink colour of paint. These are then shaded with some murky brown and green acrylic washes to give them that muddy, dirty sort of appearance that I was going for, and then finally I use some very thinned glazes of light pink and white to highlight them slightly. I now paint in the green screen sort of thing on the front of the mechanical sort of chair thing that the doctor's sitting in. And to do this, I start off with a base coat of Vallejo Game Color Extra Opaque Heavy Black Green, and then I use a wet blending technique to get a nice smooth transition all the way up to Vallejo Model Color Yellow Green, which is applied very, very sparingly in just a tiny sort of dot slash line just around the outline or the raised edge of the computer screen style of thing. I'm now going to paint these files or tube sort of things on the back of the model, and the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to have half of them as sort of like empty, just glass sort of thing, and the other half will be filled up with like a green slimy sort of liquid. So I'm going to begin by painting the glass half of it, and to do that I'm going to start off with a base coat of Ghost White, and this is painted basically on the top half of the tube style of thing. I now shade the bottom half of that half that I just painted in with the Ghost White using Reaper Master Series Rainy Grey. And I've thinned this out so it's a glaze sort of consistency, so I get a nice smooth gradation between the Ghost White and the Rainy Grey. I now use Reaper Master Series BREONNE Blue. Now this colour is going to be the colour which is going to separate the glass half of these tube file things from the liquid half. Now I'm applying this so that I'm getting a nice clean line up against the glass side, but where the liquid's going to go you don't have to worry about being messy on that half, so just make sure you're getting a nice clean line on the side which is facing the glass and you'll be fine. Alright, so now I'm base coating the areas which are going to be in that green horrible looking liquid, and to do that I'm going to be using NECROTITE green, which is a P3 paint. Now here I'm being very careful to leave a very thin line of that BREONNE blue behind. This is really important because we want that line there to separate the glass from the liquid. It's kind of realistic. It's what happens really if you have a glass of liquid. You'll see there's kind of a dark line between the liquid and just the empty space above it. So that's why we're keeping it in there. Now if you do go a bit over, that's okay. You can always go back with a fine pointed brush and your BREONNE blue to touch up that line, and you'll see, well actually you won't because I cut it out, but I actually did that. But the point is that's going to be really difficult, and unless you've got some pretty impressive brush control you're going to have a lot of trouble. So it's a lot easier if you get this right now and you just leave a nice thin line of that behind when you're base coating the slime sort of stuff in the NECROTITE green. Alright, so now I go ahead and shade that slime sort of effect, and to do that I'm going to use some heavy black green from Vallejo Game Color Extra Opaque, and that's thinned out obviously to the consistency of like a glaze, and I use that just to do a bit of shading. And then for even more contrast I use some Vallejo Game Color Blue ink as the final colour for the shading, and I thin that out again quite a bit so it's nice and transparent, and just use that on the darkest of areas. Now for the highlights on the green slimy stuff, I'm using mixtures of NECROTITE green and yellow green by Vallejo Model Color just to get aggressive highlights on there, and then eventually I finish off with just some tiny amounts of pure yellow green just on the brightest areas where the liquid would be hit by the most light, but also where it would be the thinnest because it's the most stretched out. Now there are just a few areas on the model which I think are looking a bit dull and boring. They're large sort of expanses of metal which I've actually left untouched. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to come in with some rust coloured pigments. I've got some browns, some oranges and some yellows, and I'm just going to stipple the pigment onto these areas in sort of a random fashion, but I'm also trying to highlight them, so I start off with a brown, highlight with orange and then yellow on the brightest spots. And this is just going to colour these sections in a bit, make it look almost like it's rusty or something, and just make them look a bit more interesting, and still fitting with the model though, because it's rusty, grimy and old, but just giving it a bit of a different look because I didn't want that dark sort of metallic tone. I thought it was looking a bit boring. This pigment work is then sealed in with a final coat of matte varnish. The final stage is to give a thick coat of gloss varnish to any of the areas which are glass. So that's the lens or screen sort of thing on the front of the model, and then the glass file / tube sort of things on the back. And to do this I like to use Secret Weapon, they're like water effect kind of things, They come in a nice little bottle, and it's a really thick sort of gloss varnish that works great for any sort of, thing that you want to have that super sort of gloss finish like these areas here.